Wifies doesn't understand the King in Yellow. I know, you probably only clicked on this video to accuse me of clickbait, but if you could just give me a chance, I promise I actually have an argument here. Okay? Okay. So if you're a fan of Minecraft, you've probably seen this YouTube video, searching for a world that doesn't exist. It was a pretty big deal, even Ludwig reacted to it, but in case you've been living under a rock, Searching for a World That Doesn't Exist is an ARG created by famous ARG recapper guy Wifies, who decided to try his own hand at the art form for a change. Our titular world is uncovered by a player named Avery the Mayo, who finds the file already downloaded on his new laptop. Curious, he boots it up, only to be met with a mysterious book warning him not to turn left at the crossroads. This book was written by a player named Durlord 3, the previous owner of this laptop. In a series of hidden videos, we witnessed Durlord being chased through this impossible labyrinthian Minecraft map by an unseen, malevolent entity. Journeying deeper down, he discovers a deserted civilization within an impossibly vast subterranean subspace, constructed to exalt an ominous figure known as the King in Yellow. Finally, at the shadowy heart of this cursed world, he walks through a giant gilded set of royal doors, and on the other side sees something so terrible that its very presence is redacted from the video. Believed to be the king himself in all his terrible glory, Durlord is driven mad by the sight, afflicted with a curse of infinite knowledge. Suddenly aware that this world will claim his life, he races back to spawn and leaves behind the book Avery finds at the start of our story, frantically trying to warn him of what lies beneath. And this is where our story ends. For now. Sounds like a pretty cool case of cube game cosmic horror, right? Except there's just one problem with that. That's not how the King in Yellow works. At all. No, seriously, my friend Sasha first brought this to my attention a little while ago, and I gotta be honest with you, at first I thought it was exaggerating, but after I read the original compendium of short stories for myself, I realized the terrible, awful truth. Wifies really doesn't understand the King in Yellow, and in this video, I'm going to prove it to you. I'll explain what exactly Wifies got wrong by comparing Searching for a World That Doesn't Exist to the book that inspired it, as well as other modern interpretations of the Yellow Mythos. Hopefully, in the process, we'll either learn to understand the nuances of this story a little better, or we'll become cursed with madness ourselves. So, without further ado, this is... First things first, though, we need to identify what Wifies actually misunderstands about the thematic and literal text of the source material, in order to demonstrate why this misunderstanding actually matters. The version of the Yellow Mythos as seen in Searching for a World That Doesn't Exist is plagued by a single minor misinterpretation that might seem like a semantic quibble at first, but once you unpack its implications, you realize just how serious this error actually is. Because despite what Wifies in the fandom for this video might lead you to believe, the king doesn't actually give you infinite knowledge, and nowhere in the Yellow Mythos is this even implied to be the case. No, instead, his true power is something much, much more elusive, and much more primordially horrifying. I believe this fundamental, pernicious misconception that's affected this entire fandom and its creator, if left unaddressed, has the potential to destroy everything. But to address this misconception, we have to address the text from which the Yellow Mythos stems. And it all starts here. The King in Yellow, a collection of short stories published in 1895 and written by American Romantic author Robert W. Chambers. In the intervening centuries, the cosmic horror contained within these humble pages has served as the inspiration for an innumerable host of eldritch horrors, with this text even going on to influence H.P. Lovecraft, filmmaker Cary Joy Fukunaga, and even Wifies himself. To truly understand the Yellow Mythos and all of its modern incarnations and reinterpretations, I recommend you read the book for yourself, as you can find it fairly easily for free online. But since that's probably too much work for you, I've decided to summarize the text in its entirety here in this video. And yes, that means I will be covering every single short story, even the romantic ones in the back half of the book, because honestly, I think this is where a lot of the Wifies theorist community has gone wrong. Up until now, the latter tales of the King in Yellow have been completely disregarded as irrelevant to the ARG at hand, since its mentions to the king himself grow increasingly scarce. However, in my opinion, the second half of the book itself contains the most fascinating thematic sinew of the entire text. The first half of The King in Yellow serves as a sort of supernatural primer, conditioning the audience to adopt the same state of maddening paranoia as its characters. As literal and overt mentions of the king begin to vanish from the book, their absence grows all the more conspicuous, which forces the reader to do the heavy lifting and put the pieces together for themselves, as they reckon with the primordial forces of terror the Yellow Mythos really represents. And if you really want to understand the story Wifies is trying to tell here in all its glory, you owe it to yourself to grapple with the works of art that so clearly inspired his work. It goes without saying, but spoilers for the entirety of The King in Yellow will follow. So get comfortable under the covers and turn off the lights, because I've got a tale to tell you, and it starts like this. The narrator of our first story, Hildred, is a man fresh out of an asylum for the mentally deranged, an incarceration he believes to be wrongful and for which he blames his doctor. It's no surprise that Hildred was committed, though. This is, after all, the America of the 1920s. In this alternate history, so radically different from our own, America has begun segregating its population by race, legalized murder by the state, and grown increasingly isolationist and autocratic as it claims to have entered a golden age of unprecedented prosperity. The entire nation has flattened and homogenized, and to disrupt this authoritarian aesthetic tapestry has come a curious new play known as The King in Yellow. Little is known about the actual play itself, though it appears to be the story of a pale-masked stranger descending upon a royal court and seducing its inhabitants into madness. Hildred, for his part, initially discovered The King in Yellow during his stay in the asylum. A work of literature described as the essence of purest poison, the play is part of a broader groundswell of societal upheaval and national derangement. To that end, the American government has legalized the creation of suicide booths for the mentally ill to put themselves out of their misery. Hildred's main preoccupation throughout the story is his desire to play matchmaker for his cousin Lewis, introducing him to a local lady named Constance. However, these efforts are derailed and opposed by a shadowy friend of Hildred's he first met fresh out of the asylum, a sallow-faced creature with false ears and yellowing skin named Mr. Wilde, the titular repairer of reputations. Wilde seems madder than even Hildred and regularly references the play within the book, reverently invoking the name of the King in Yellow as he unravels a sinister plot to overthrow the American government and unite the entire continent into an empire. As the titular repairer of reputations, Wilde performs precisely the function his job describes. He repairs reputations by making use of an uncanny ability almost akin to future sight, in exchange for those he assists swearing fealty to his mad king and king-making insurrection. Years pass in the blink of an eye. Ignoring the concerns of his family, Hildred continues to visit Wilde and assist in his plan, all while growing increasingly demented and violent. He starts to display symptoms of the same extratemporal awareness Wilde himself possesses, the tense of his narration shifting abruptly between past, present, and future. At last, Hildred arranges to meet one final time with Lewis, whose wedding with Constance is fast approaching. When Lewis arrives for his midnight rendezvous with his cousin, Hildred unfurls a parchment etching of the Yellow Sign, a symbol of the dread king, and darkly declares his grand design to bring about the imperial dynasty of America. Lewis, concerned for Hildred, says he sounds unwell, and Hildred reveals that he has already murdered his doctor, and that dear Constance, too, has been slain. Lewis, infuriated and inconsolable, chases Hildred, who gleefully flees back to Wilde's office and dons a gilded crown, proclaiming himself to be the king incarnate. In the dark, he hears someone creeping closer and lashes out with a blade, only to skewer Wilde, his twisted mentor. With a start, Hildred realizes that he knew all along that he would be the cause of Wilde's ultimate demise. With his master falling limp and lifeless to the floor, Hildred is apprehended by the police and dragged away, kicking and screaming about his divine birthright, as Lewis and a very much alive Constance look on in sorrow and concern. The implications of her presence at the end of this story cannot be overstated. We can no longer trust Hildred, nor indeed any other narrator in the book, to accurately relate to us reality. The text of the book itself has been afflicted with the madness of the King in Yellow. And with this tone of mounting suspense set, our tale continues. The second story in this compendium concerns a love triangle of artists. Our narrator, Alec, is invited by his sculptor friend Boris to behold a brand new forbidden method he has discovered to create life out of stone, or vice versa. Boris simply dips a living creature into a mysterious pool that glows with golden sunlight, and they instantaneously petrify into marble. Perturbed by this discovery, Boris says that he intends to conceal the pool so as to let the secret of the sun die with him. Alec, a painter, agrees, likening its destructive power to the impact photography has had on his own art. Despite enjoying one another's company, Boris and Alec share a fraught past. Once, they both vied for the love of a woman named Genevieve, who served as their model and muse. Boris's great masterpiece was a sculpture called Madonna, modeled on her, which eventually won her heart. However, despite the fact that Alec loves her still, they have maintained a pretension of cordiality and friendship, as Genevieve is still fond of Alec and even has the painter decorate her boudoir. As Alec works in and around Boris and Genevieve's home, sometimes staying the night, tensions begin to simmer between the three of them, with Boris nearly dunking Alec into the sunlit pool on accident before thinking better of himself. Their hostilities come to a head, however, when a sickly and morose Genevieve calls out that she still loves Alec, but will always love Boris better. Heartbroken, Alec falls deathly ill. For 2 years, he drifts in and out of a comatose stupor, physically sick at himself and his behavior, appalled by how he had betrayed both of his good friends by harboring this shameful secret. In the height of his delirium, he remembers a play he read about a yellow king who wore a pale mask, much like his own mask of amicability around his friends. Stricken with paralysis and prescience, Alex sees a glimpse into his own future and comes to believe he has only ever existed to play a small part in the story of Boris and Genevieve. Upon recovering from his illness, Alec races to the home of his friends, spurred on by some terrible premonition, only to discover that they have both died in the intervening years. Genevieve, who had been growing increasingly depressed after his illness, threw herself into the sunlit pool, and Boris shot himself through the heart in his grief. Collapsing into tears, Alec crumples to the floor, as unbeknownst to him, one by one, the marble sculptures touched by the gilded water of the pool melt and spring back to life, awakening Genevieve, who had previously been frozen in an embrace with her stony self of the Madonna. Our third story takes place in the Church of St. Barnabé, an 18th century Rococo construction riddled with a much older, medieval sense of paranoia. Our narrator, too, claims he is of an older generation who does not seek nor believe in the psychological subtleties of art, but today he feels perturbed by the playing of the organ. The beat is frantic and hunted, and he believes it blasphemous. Perhaps this perception is owed more to the color of his mood, however, as he has been awake for 3 days and 3 nights straight, reading The King in Yellow. As the preacher starts his service, our narrator sees the organ player slinking away and at last feels at peace. The preacher claims the human soul cannot be harmed by the forces of evil, and our parishioner finds this an odd break with church doctrine, but just then, he sees the hateful organist emerging once again from his instrument, from exactly the same way he came before. Perturbed by this spatial temporal impossibility and feeling paranoid, he leaves the church only to once more find himself stalked by the organist. This relentless pursuit persists through the Parisian streets, with our protagonist becoming increasingly convinced that the organist is out to steal his very soul, and by the time the safety of his domicile is in sight, night has fallen. Ominously, the organist cuts him off and backs him down into the shadows, trapping our protagonist by the entrance of the Rue des Dragons. Before his soul can be taken from him, the parishioner awakes in church, having slept through the sermon. Relieved, convinced the malice and horror he experienced were figments of his sleep-deprived, nightmarish mind, he casts his eyes over the comforting sight of his familiar church, and, wanting to dispel the last traces of his nightmare, makes the fatal mistake of once more staring down the organist. With a blare of his mournful, sky-shattering horns, the instrument blasts away every person in the church, evaporating them into beams of pure light. The Rococo ceiling fades into the starry skies of Lake Hali, the shadowy parapets of Carcosa appear, the Hyades glimmer in the sky above, and from all around and inside of him, our horrified protagonist trembles in fear as the voice of the King in Yellow himself booms. It is a terrible thing to fall into the hands of a living god. Our main character, Scott, is an artist involved in an amorous affair with his model, Tessie. Time and time again, he tries to paint her, but finds himself perturbed by the sight of a shadowy, sunken-faced watchman lurking in the courtyard just outside the window of his studio. When this paranoia causes Scott to accidentally paint Tessie with sallow, yellowing skin, Scott slashes the canvas to ribbons and confesses the cause of his anxiety to her. Rather than laughing it off as ridiculous, though, Tessie claims she dreams every night of a city with no lights or life, and the driver of a dark hearse with a dark horse carrying a coffin which Scott himself is trapped inside of. Upon seeing the fat, bald face of the watchman, she becomes convinced that he was the hearse driver in her dream. That very night, Scott is plagued by his own dream in which he is inside the very same coffin that Tessie saw, staring up through a pane of glass, his body embalmed, while the watchman asks him, "Have you found the yellow sign?" Scott, still mourning the end of his affair with his former lover, Sylvia, deepens his relationship with Tessie. After Scott sprains his wrist and can no longer paint, she gives him a clasp of black onyx as a present, upon which is emblazoned a small golden rune. Unable to shake the feeling of dread itching at the back of his mind, Scott searches through his study for something to read to pass the time with Tessie, only to stumble upon The King in Yellow. Scott is horrified. He thought he banned the play from his household after the awful fate that befell his good friend Hildred. But before he can ask Tessie where she found it, she snatches it up and playfully runs off, thinking his disapproval of the book to be a kind of game. The injured Scott hobbles through his home frantically, but by the time he finds her, it's already too late. Tessie has read the fateful second act, which drove Hildred himself to madness. Knowing now with a curious certainty that the onyx clasp she gave him bears the yellow sign itself, Tessie weeps and begs Scott to take it off and save himself. Scott, however, refuses. He too has already been paralyzed by a dark and dangerous vision of the terrible night that is to come. He sees the watchman sweeping into the room and tearing away Tessie's soul, then the police finding him dying the following morning with the bodies of both his lover and the watchman by his side. Surely, he thinks, they will suspect that he is the culprit, but to the terror of all, the living corpse of the watchman will have been dead for months. Our next tale is of Philip, a foolhardy young man who has found himself profoundly lost in timeless moors of murky fog. Stumbling blindly through the swamp with no sign of food or shelter in sight, he is spotted by a hunting falcon. The bird leads him back to its owner, a royal lady named Jeanne, and Philip begs her to let him stay with her for the night. Accompanying this noble lady is a falconer named Hastur, a name which, in our previous tales, has been the title of a terrible city of madness associated with the King in Yellow, and her guardian Louis, who has been like a father to her. Taking pity on Philip, Jeanne agrees, though she adds she is surprised to see Philip, claiming it would take him centuries to find his way back from whence he came. The next morning, Philip awakens to find himself dressed in medieval garb, and though he thinks the cryptic and antiquated vernacular of the locals peculiar, he quickly falls for Jeanne. As she takes him back out to hunt and retrace his steps from the following day, her falcons screech danger, and Philip is bitten by a viper, which he crushes underfoot. When he comes to, Jeanne's castle is in a ruin, windswept and desolate, as if centuries have passed since he fell unconscious from the poison in his veins. Philip finds her grave with an epitaph claiming she died long, long ago of heartbreak, but the woman's glove atop the cold stone of her tomb is still warm. What follows next are a series of brief and esoteric tone poems, meditatively and reflexively commenting on all the stories in the compendium that are yet to come and have already unfolded, which served as Chambers' original inspiration for the entire collection of short stories. The studio, an artist seals himself within a gilded, hearth-lit room of sculptures and glittering glass. The phantom, a creature of the past, unable to turn back and mourn for love long lost. The sacrifice, a woman pours an urn of her love's blood upon a field of flowers, staining rows of pristine white petals red. Destiny, a man refuses the call and crosses the bridge, time unfolding around him. The throng, the jester, the green room, wherein a clown and the pale mask of death compete with one another in vanity and love. The love test. Each prose poem is more vague and illusory than the last, and each leaves the reader scrambling desperately for any semblance of a connection to the myth and aura of the dreaded Yellow King, perfectly setting the tone for the back half of the book, in which the reader will be expected to do the very same thing. Our perspective shifts fully to third person for the first time in the book. This time our main character is an artist named Severn taking in a wary cat, a subtle parallel to Hildred, who in his bouts of violent mania became preoccupied with killing a cat living inside the office of the Repairer of Reputations. This cat, however, wears a loose pink garter around its neck, this fashionable lady's garment and its poor fit indicating it must have been wandering the streets starved. Severn thinks its owner must be a very beautiful woman and coaxes the cat into loving him through food while he searches his apartment building for its owner. Severn's fellow tenants say the cat must belong to a woman on the abandoned north wing of their building, which appears bombed out and completely desolate. However, their reports of the woman herself conflict. She may be a vain and haughty woman, or good and pious. The name listed on the cat's garter says Sylvia Elvin, a surname which reminds Severn of a town where he claims to have met Lady Fate herself, who shared that same name. Clearly possessing a poet's mind, he reasons that though Fate herself was unkind to him, Sylvia must have been a far kinder woman to take in such a helpless little creature as this emaciated kitten. Creeping back through his desolate and dilapidated apartment building, he slinks into Sylvia's bedroom, where, stricken by supernatural awareness, he realizes that she is dead and always has been. Silently, he presses a chaste kiss to her brow. Set during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, our main characters are Jack, an American artist, and Sylvia, his love. Jack, at only 22, has suspended his passion projects as he tries to look out for the younger ones in the Latin Quarter, left orphaned by the constant bombing of his block. During a gathering he hosts in solidarity with his neighbors, he is summoned to come to the aid of a fellow American accused of being a German spy by the name of Hartmann. Upon hearing Hartmann's name, Sylvia shrieks in despair and reveals that he shared a sordid past with her before she met Jack, when she was barely even a child. Much is left unsaid, but Sylvia weeps that some other force keeps her bound to her abuser. All the same, she begs Jack not to go, fearing she will lose him in the fighting. Conflicted and unsure of how to feel, as a stony-faced Jack leaves his apartment, he is assailed by the phantoms from the shelling throughout the story, both literal and figurative, the ghosts of this ghastly war swimming through blood in the streets. Turned around in the chaos, he races back home to find the French Quarter bombed, with his street the site where the first shell had fallen. Terrified, he bursts back into his apartment and embraces Sylvia, who is caring for a crying baby. This is the other she mentioned before, the child that Hartmann sired, taking advantage of her in her youth and naivete. The horrors he had witnessed having put their love into perspective, Jack accepts the baby as their own and reaffirms his commitment and love to Sylvia. In stark contrast to the war-torn Paris of the 1870s, we now shift our focus to a quiet, unassuming Parisian street in peacetime, and a boarding house where a young American artist is visiting. Hastings, our man abroad, has just come of age and is adrift for his first international sojourn in the City of Love. He studies the arts religiously, visits gardens and strolls down halcyon tree-lined streets, takes in marble statues, and becomes enamored in particular with the blank, pale mask of a face worn by a marble archer, the face of the god of love. Entranced, he takes a Parisian girl with whom he has become enamored to see the statue, but his date, Valentine, describes the god of love as a coward and a sneak, always shooting one when they least expect it. Despite Valentine's surly disposition and her deep-seated belief in dreams and superstitions, their affection for one another grows over the ensuing months until, early one morning, Hastings decides to abandon his studies and abscond with Valentine on a carriage ride out in the country, as Valentine dreamed they would. As they speed off, Valentine professes that she is too broken for the innocent young Hastings, but he cares not, and they share a kiss. Our final story, as have the stories before it, begins with a poem. The first half of the book concerned motifs of yellow and excerpts of the king, his mysterious Hyades, and fair Carcosa. The second half of the book, set on romantic Parisian streets, concerns flowery motifs of pink, with the two colors permeating these respective stories too. But this final poem repudiates both. It rejects this false dichotomy between colors and claims it would reject sight and hue altogether for the sake of love. Clifford, a wizened teacher of the arts who previously instructed young Hastings, is approached by another American artist named Selby. During a trip out in the town, the two see a mysterious woman ensconced beneath a parasol out on the high street. This fair lady serves as a sort of muse to all the artists in school. They do not know her name, and so only refer to her as Rue Barry, literally translating to a barred street, romanticizing her mystery and unreachability. After seeing her again before a flower vendor's stall, Selby becomes entranced by her mystery and buys tons of flowers for his room, a gesture which Clifford mocks. Despondent after another night of aimlessly imbibing, young Selby wanders the streets past a dragon statue and onto an avenue he does not recognize. He feels untethered from reality in these strange, shifting shadows, as if he is going mad. At last he finds himself blocked down a dead-end street by a barrier wall with the name of his elusive muse graffitied upon it, Rue Barry, road blocked. Glancing up into the window beside him and motivated by a sudden impulse, Selby climbs up the balcony window and finds a woman beckoning him inside, Rue Barry herself. He slinks in through the aperture of her window like Hildred did in the office of Mr. Wilde, his own thoughts growing wilder all the while. And now, Suddenly, and all at once, Selby, like so many before him, is stricken with a sense of prescience, foreboding. He too realizes that this fixation with Rue is doomed, as he heeds the call of some dark inner voice. Bidding him farewell, the lady unfastens the latch on the gate for him, and he departs, with a rose withdrawn from the vase by her bedside table. And thus, our story ends. So, that was a lot to wrap your head around in a single sitting, huh? But what does it all mean? And more importantly, what does it even mean for our favorite ARG of Minecraft men? Well, let's break it all down step by step. The first 4 stories of the text concern the king directly. He only appears incarnate in one of them, the Court of the Dragon, though the other 3 tales at the start of the book do feature dread emissaries of his unholy message. The next 2 installments of the book no longer mention the king by name, but invoke characters, locations, and symbolic motifs established in the previous 4 stories, the Hyades, Hastur, and the King's Pale Mask. The last 4 stories are much lighter in tone writ large and shift our setting from America to the gentle streets of fair Paris, but if you know where to look, mention of the book's core thematic tenets still abound. For instance, there's the repeated mention of women named Sylvia, different characters that serve as instances of the same theme, their stories of sordid pasts and flights of fancy, weaving together into a single continuous tale. All of our protagonists are obsessed with the arts, too, with many being craftsmen themselves. Based on this, we can discern 2 key things. First, the King in Yellow is indeed a literal entity, yes, but he is also symbolic, an all-consuming mono-metaphor. It's no surprise that he comes to rule the Americas through dread and fear, preying on political instability and sentiments of authoritarianism to pervert the nation into cynical madness. But even more maddening than these, Chambers argues, are art and love. Think back to the Street of Our Fair Lady of the Fields, often dismissed as an unimportant addition to the Yellow mythos. Hastings becomes obsessed with a stony sculpture with a pale mask, but rather than recognizing it as the pale mask of the King in Yellow, we are explicitly told that it is a depiction of Cupid. To love and to live, argues Chambers through every story in the book, is to succumb to madness. And throughout these stories, he professes an almost radical artistic devotion to love itself, especially given the prohibitive puritanism of his time. A man embraces both his wife and the child she conceived out of wedlock with another. A painter is steadily driven past the brink by his dueling affections for his 2 friends and their salacious flirtations with the taboo of polyamory. Even in the very first story, The Repair of Reputations, Constance's father is an armorer who sympathizes with Hildred's obsessive compulsions due to the nature of his own craft. In essence, the King in Yellow is able to wield the humanities themselves. Art, love, politics, relationships, family, friends, our socialized world, the stuff of classical human flourishing in a purely Socratic sense to drive the human race mad and accomplish his sinister ends. These are the weapons which the King in Yellow wields. And secondly, infinite knowledge plays a role in absolutely none of these stories. Rather, to drive his victims insane, the king gives them a very specific type of knowledge, a metatextual awareness of their own fictitiousness and their situation within a broader narrative. Hildred knows he will kill Wilde before he even sets foot inside his study. Alec realizes he is but a puppet in the tragedy of Boris and Genevieve. Scott is able to prophesize the hour of his own death and the shadowy place to which the Watchman will abscond with the soul of his love. Selby heeds some dark, determined inner voice that reminds him of the futility and familiarity of his circumstances. All of our protagonists in the book become aware of how their own stories will end. They aren't shown the horrors of the universe in its totality. The king shows them his fair city of Carcosa, specifically, in all its maddening, eternal majesty, impenetrable by mortal minds. And here, too, all of our protagonists are searching for a glimpse of eternity, either through love, the arts, or both, in pursuit of a perfectly pristine muse upon which to project themselves. The king doesn't give his subjects infinite knowledge, he gives them forbidden knowledge. To me, at least, the latter is infinitely scarier than the former. This is how the King in Yellow actually works. Now I know what you're thinking. But Frostbyte, that sounds like a mighty tenuous distinction you're drawing out here. Aren't you just nitpicking about semantics? Does it really matter if the King in Yellow gives you infinite knowledge rather than forbidden knowledge? Yes. Yes, it does. And I can prove it. To show you why the metatextual and artistic philosophy of Robert W. Chambers is indispensable to the Yellow Mythos, we're going to look at a few more modern interpretations of infinite knowledge, as well as a few contemporary adaptations of The King in Yellow that Wifies takes clear inspiration from. And in doing so, you'll begin to understand why understanding The King in Yellow is itself a recipe for insanity. In Jorge Luis Borges' 1947 short story, The Immortal, the city of the immortals itself isn't actually a source of terror or dread. This tale, following in the artistic tradition of Chambers' King in Yellow, features a Roman legionnaire separated from his legions wandering aimlessly in the desert until he happens upon the titular city, around which lurk sinister throngs of desiccated, gray-skinned half-men, barely sentient and scarcely breathing. The architecture of the city is described as infinite and dread-inducing, but even though it deeply disturbs our protagonist, we ourselves do not experience the same horror. We cannot perceive the impenetrable city, so it merely lurks in our minds, building suspense. But when we learn that the beast men forbidden from entering the city are the immortals, then the terror strikes us as we realize these horrible creatures are once the greatest men and women in all our history, artists and poets and authors one and all of them have been driven mad by glimpsing even a sliver of truly forbidden knowledge. Another short story by Borges, The Library of Babel, concerns an infinite repository of all the knowledge humankind has ever amassed, and even knowledge we haven't. Though the contents of each book are totally random, the laws of probability dictate that at least some books in this higher order infinity must be legible. The library itself is not a source of horror for Borges, though, and when one of its inhabitants passes away, they are hoisted over the banister of the library guardrail and sent to plummet downwards through its infinite floors, falling forever, returned to the infinite knowledge to which they dedicated themselves to become one with this impossible structure. In a way, it's almost touching, like a burial at sea. The point is that infinity simply cannot be contained inside of our tiny human skulls. It's too big to be scary. But the vastness of infinity, the terror of space, only becomes terrible when you make it relative. The sublimity of the stars only strikes you when you consider yourself contextually within them. Infinity only becomes scary when we realize that it makes us small. Philosopher Edmund Burke formalized this principle in a 1757 treatise entitled A Philosophical Inquiry into the Origins of Our Ideas of the Sublime and Beautiful. By his account, the most emotionally and aesthetically evocative artistic subjects were not beautiful, but rather dreadful, a concept he regarded as the sublime. Sublime, after all, is a derivative of a Latin root for elevated, which Burke took to mean the most ascendant form of human engagement with art and experience. The sublime has several dimensions, the most important of which being its dreadfulness, obscurity, vastness, power, and succession. But the latter is most important for our purposes, as Burke believes that the sublime is an artificial sort of infinity, seeming to succeed past its limits to strain at the very edges of our perception with its sheer might. The sublime, by necessity, by its very nature, makes you self-aware of your own insignificance within and before it. In his words, no passion so effectually robs the mind of all its powers of acting and reasoning as fear. You could not ask for a single more perfectly distilled treatise on the ethos, symbolism, and powers of The King in Yellow. And this interpretation of The King in Yellow as a source of forbidden knowledge rather than infinite knowledge isn't a new one either. In fact, it's a pivotal part of the most famous modern interpretation of the Yellow Mythos, the first season of True Detective, directed by Carrie Joy Fukunaga, and starring Woody Harrelson and Matthew McConaughey. Very briefly, True Detective's first season is the story of Martin Hart, a by-the-numbers true blue bully of a workhorse cop, and his enigmatic philosopher of a partner, Rustin Cole. Marty and Rust are assigned to cover a series of bizarre, ritualistic serial slayings taking place all across Louisiana, killings directly inspired by The King in Yellow. Our setting is rendered with painstaking similarity to the America of the Repair of Reputations, which America has, of course, become. Marty and Rust are made to see firsthand the failures of policing, the corruption of the state, and the carried internal hypocrisy of their own masculinity and philosophies of life as they realize that the forces in which they have vested their own trust aren't just complicit, they are directly implicated in what at first appears to be a series of backwater murders. Throughout the series, Rust and Marty aren't given infinite knowledge. They are very specifically given forbidden knowledge, On a literal level, this refers to their realization that the pedophilic cult-like conspiracy they've been investigating has permeated every level of government and capital, and there's nothing they can do to reach the perpetrators at the heart of this darkness. But on a thematic level, they've also been given a glimpse into their metatextual function as characters within their narrative. When questioning Reggie Ledoux, the first character in the series to invoke the Yellow King by name, and their first real suspect in the serial slaying case, Reggie warns Rust that,
"I know what happens next. I saw you in my dream. You're in Carcosa now."
Meaning Carcosa, that terrible city of the stars. Every character afflicted by the madness of the king repeatedly tries to warn Rust and Marty that they are trapped inside a chain of causality, bound by their past choices. And they are, literally, in a loop, stuck inside the confines of their single season of television, never able to break free of the cycle and warn their audience of the forbidden knowledge they've gained. They always arrive too late to save the day. Our protagonist's flashbacks are literally filmed in-universe, allowing them to stare directly at us as they deliver their solemn warnings. This loop of maddening artistic recursivity to Fukunaga is what Carcosa means. In the final episode of True Detective's first season, Marty and Rust confront one of the perpetrators of the murderous cult they've been chasing. Errol Childress, the illegitimate son of a powerful local sheriff whose worship of the Yellow King has participants all across Louisiana's most powerful sectors. Childress is explicitly paralleled to Mr. Wilde from the Repair of Reputations, right down to his physical deformities and outright depravity. Like Wilde, he too is attempting to build a simulacrum of Carcosa out on his shadowy estate. Marty and Rust give chase to Errol and are cornered by him deep below ground, with no hope of escape. But before Childress can strike the killing blow, the ceiling of the cave overhead fades into the starry skies of Lake Hali, the shadowy parapets of Carcosa appear, the Hyades glimmer in the sky up above, and our horrified protagonists tremble in fear. This is the moment when the king afflicts both Marty and Rust. It's the reason why Marty, whose salt-of-the-earth personality previously clashed with the philosophical Rust, suddenly becomes so morose by the story's end. He's been cursed by forbidden knowledge, and his worldview, not to mention his trust in the institutions he swore to uphold, has been completely shattered. And yet Rust, who was formerly a skeptic and pessimist, has had the inverse revelation. He finds something oddly freeing about his awareness of his metatextual situation, about realizing the role he is to play in this story. With the king's forbidden knowledge, he can see his audience, the viewers of his show, and he uses this knowledge to deliver to them one last warning, hoping they can learn the lessons he failed to and succeed where he could not. The whole of True Detective is meant to point metatextually back at itself, to ask the viewer to reckon with the systematic failings that have enshrined the abuses of those who hold power in America. But because True Detective itself was allowed to exist, and because the people might someday recognize the systematic failings of their own world, according to Rust...
You're looking at her on the sky thing. How's that? Well, once there was only dark. Yes, we need lights when it...
Does that maybe sound familiar to anyone you might already know? That's right. I believe that Wifies' Durlord is meant to be an adaptation of Matthew McConaughey's Emmy Award-winning performance of Rust and Cole. And now, at last, we arrive back where we started. Finally, after analyzing every modern incarnation of the King in Yellow, we're properly equipped to tackle his depiction in searching for a world that doesn't exist. Right away, we can see the disciplines of the humanities by which the King in Yellow operates, transmuting and taking upon a new form, the form of video games. And a game is the perfect place for the King to play, after all, as a perfectly interactive form of art. When Durlord first enters this metatextual backstage and flees from the entity chasing him down the first tunnel, he confesses to feeling compelled, as if he has no idea where the impulse to run away arose from, a common symptom of those under the sway of the King. Except here, the game itself is the work of art that is slowly seeping madness into the base of his skull. Durlord, however, is smart. He's able to immediately identify that he's being pursued and tries multiple times to lose the entity tailing him, setting trap after trap to try and confirm its presence and anomalous properties. The reason why he has to set his chunk update traps without telling the viewer, however, is because for all his smarts, the King in Yellow is so far beyond him. He sees through the metatextual veil that separated Durlord from his in-game dialogue. Durlord is a brilliant protagonist, but he never stood a chance. The King is sublimity beyond mere mortal brilliance. He is a living god. He is Pursuit incarnate. As Durlord journeys deeper into the world that does not exist, he is continuously reminded of how surreal his surroundings are. When he stalls at the gate, he is forced to translate an inscrutable and heavily encoded poem, and because this intermission marks as the only break between the two clips of the world Durlord uploaded to his Google Drive, it perfectly mirrors the break between Acts 1 and 2 of the play The King in Yellow, whose contents caused the first psychotic breaks in the King's victims. This means that if you watch the second half of this video by Wifies, it's already too late, both for you and for him, and yet Durlord continues deeper, yet still compelled further by a force he cannot comprehend, not yet prescient enough to see the truth. Impossibly, the subterranean superstructure seems to be built below build limit, yet outside our conventional understanding of Minecraft's dimensions entirely. Durlord finds an entire village, perhaps a man-made echo of a vision of Carcosa, but it is abandoned, a hollow single-player reflection of what would otherwise be a teeming community, deprived of the human connections that the king is so skilled at manipulating to his sinister ends. And the statue at the heart of this village reminds us of the winged god of love fervently adored by Hastings. And then we arrive at the video's climax. Wifies' masterstroke of suspense, shot entirely in first-person perspective, rendered as silently and solemnly as the grave. This is the best possible use of his particular video format, as the comfortable barrier between narrator, spectator, and player completely degenerates, letting us experience the terror of Durlord firsthand. Once again, Durlord receives a warning imploring him to turn back from another player long past, but just like with the play, just like with the book, just like with the mythos of the secret keeper of the Hyades, we cannot look away. Durlord digs through the wall, piercing the literal veil of the narrative and entering the brooding metatextual chasm at its core. As he does, all of the blocks in his inventory are immediately transformed into the precise arrangement and bizarre assortment of items he will need to send his final message to the viewer. Because the king knows. He has always known that this is Durlord's fate. This is the forbidden knowledge that he will be paralyzed with when his mind is torn asunder. And at the end of the tunnel, behind the final door, is the thing that will do the tearing. What lurks behind this door is the essence of purest poison. So, what is behind the door? It could very much be a vision of the king himself, appearing as he did in the Court of the Dragon, and behind him looms the starry sky and swirling cosmic gateway of his horrible Carcosa. After all, the entity that stalks Durlord through every hidden hall operates very similarly to the organist in that very same story, unbound by the laws of space, time, and mortal logic. It's entirely possible, though, that just behind this sensor is the yellow sign, that emblem which plants the festering seed of paranoia into the mind of the viewer, and unlocks their consciousness to the king's all-consuming power. Durlord's paranormal pursuer could very easily be an interpretation of the Watchman from the first story to show us the yellow sign directly, too. But if Durlord has been cursed with infinite knowledge in this moment, his story becomes infinitely less fascinating and tragic to me. How could he possibly parse through the sheer volume of infinity to glimpse the terror the king wishes him to behold? But if the king curses him with forbidden knowledge of his fate, if the king shows him his metatextual situation, and reveals to Durlord that his role is merely to curse another innocent victim in Avery, then it all makes sense. Because it means that Durlord was driven insane by the two things the King in Yellow has always represented throughout time: art and love. He was driven mad by the impossible artistic artifice of this world that never existed, driven mad by his love and concern and genuine human compassion for another man he never even met. He knew his effort to save Avery from his own fate was likely doomed, and yet he struggled valiantly to save him regardless, even after the king had already claimed his mind in madness. And the thing is, Wifies wouldn't even need to retcon searching for a world that doesn't exist to preserve the original forbidden knowledge interpretation of the Yellow Mythos, because just like how the original book doesn't actually state anything about infinite knowledge, Wifies' first video doesn't either. All we know is that Durlord is stricken by a form of prescience regarding the events of his own story, allowing him to foretell Avery's coming and write the book to warn him of the terrible choice at the crossroads. That's still perfectly consistent with the way the King in Yellow's powers are portrayed in the original text. But if Wifies continues down the path of this narrative without realizing the paradox that a curse of infinite knowledge would create, it could cause his entire story to turn left at the crossroads of metatextual confusion and away from a salient, thematically cohesive narrative. And in my opinion, a story this good, feeding further into its fanbase's misconceptions to potentially undermine the strengths of its own narrative, would be a misstep. So, where will Wifies go from here? If you ask me, there's only one natural conclusion. After all, Wifies is the one telling us this story, and metatextually, even reading The King in Yellow has the capacity to drive one to madness as the reader attempts to comprehend and consume the work artistically. The logical endpoint for this ARG is that our narrator, Wifies too, grows increasingly demented and deranged, losing touch with reality as he tries to create the very world he describes, a metatextual situation driven by the cruel, withered hand of a mad king. We've already seen love drive Wifies insane before, after all, or a version of Wifies at the very least. He understands better than perhaps anyone the terrible power of such a text. That's why he's chosen to craft this story around these specific constraints. Wifies says at the end of Searching for a World That Doesn't Exist that this story isn't over. And he's right. But the king isn't just coming for Avery. It's coming for him, too. So in the future, don't be surprised if you start to notice something a little bit off about Wifies' voiceovers or a bit of mania and paranoia bleeding into the text of his community posts. After all, if you stare for too long into the void stares back. Perhaps Robert W. Chambers said it best himself all those years ago.
This is the thing that troubles me. For I cannot forget Carcosa, where black stars hang in the heavens, where the shadows of men's thoughts lengthen in the afternoon, where the twin suns sink into the lake of Folly, and my mind will bear forever the memory of the pallid mask. I pray God will curse the writer as the writer has cursed the world with its beautiful, stupendous creation, terrible in its simplicity, irresistible in its truth. A world which now trembles before the King in Yellow. It is a terrible thing to fall into the hands of a living God.
I'm Frostbyte Freeman, and until next time, stay frosty.